Hello, WāKahikoWednesday. My name is Kapalikū. I'm a culture educator here at the BishopMuseum, and welcome to another edition of WāKahikoWednesdays. Today, we're going to be taking a look at some things that have to do with this time of the season and one of the traditional akua, or gods, that applies to the season we're in, which happens to be summertime, or what we call in Hawaiian the kauwela. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce an akua that some folks may have a little introduction to, but others may not know. His name is Kapalikū, and today we'll be sharing a little bit of the space inside this area of Hawaiian Hall with him. Now, the story of Kapalikū is long, and it does involve our museum throughout most of his history. But while we might tell that story in another edition of WāKahiko Wednesdays, I just want to acknowledge his presence as someone who has been cared for, almost like a kupuna here in our museum. But when we think of kupuna, when we think of the WāKahiko, the times past, we might also think of the traditional akua, the Hawaiian gods that our ancestors, our kupuna here in Hawaii, worshipped. Among them were four primary male gods: Kane, Kanaloa, Lono, and the akua also known as Ku. In many other parts of the Pacific, Ku, or Tu, is a primary god for human interaction. Ku has many responsibilities in daily life, as well as the life of chiefs, of priests, and even other gods. But today we'll be looking at some of the objects that relate to those primary responsibilities of Ku as he relates to Hawaiian culture. Here in this case, if we take a close look, we might notice a certain theme that has to do with one of Ku's forms. And in some stories, particularly here in Hawaii, the akua, the atua, the different gods have their own physical materials or manifestations that apply to them in the world that we interact with them. In this case, we might notice a theme, and that theme is lawai'a, the Hawaiian word for fishing. Very obviously, we can see that there are two large makau, two large fish hooks, and two other objects that have a fish-like form, anui'a. The two makau are made for catching quite large fish. One of them is for catching ulua, the other might be used for catching mano, or sharks. Now these relate to one aspect of Ku, who is known as Ku'ula, or sometimes Ku'ulakai. And in traditional stories of Ku'ulakai, he comes from the island of Maui. And in his family is the power to invoke and call any kind of fish that he desires. He passes this power on to his son, Ai. And Ai, in turn, passes on these abilities to Kanaka, to people. In doing so, he allows people to practice those skills of lawai'a, sometimes what we call modern day hanapa'a, although traditionally the idea of lawai'a is very important in Hawaiian culture because fish give us our primary protein sources. And when we think about the relationships between our activities and the gods who are responsible for them or in charge of them, well, fishing is kind of a big deal here in Hawaii and in other Pacific islands. So we privilege that idea of ku'ulakai as one particular god related to fishing. But fishing is not all that Ku can do. In many of his forms, Ku is associated with grand things, with almost state-like presence. There is Ku Nuiakea, who's associated with governance. Ku Ho'one'enu, Ku Holopali, all of these larger ideas. But there is one Ku that, even today, we still acknowledge in the practices of our people in Hawaii, and that is Ku Pa'aikea. To talk about Ku Pa'aikea, let's take a look at this object here. Some of us might recognize this in English as an adze, but an adze in Hawaiian is called a ko'i. But to back up just a little bit, when we think about objects made for functional purposes, but objects that can also be functional in a ritual sense, we think about materials that are useful. This object is made out of la'au, made of wood, and stone, using cordage to bind. Now that same kind of cordage might also have been used to bind the line for our makau, the two fish hooks that we saw earlier. One of them is made from what we might call iwi kohola or iwi palawa, which is to say whalebone, a very strong material with its own advantages over using wood. However, a very special case as we have here in Hawaii, one of those makau is made from wood, but it's not wood that is cut from a plank, drawn out and carved. It is wood that has been grown into the shape of a hook, or near as you can be to it, which allows the fibers and the natural strength of that wood to continue along that curve. Now, anybody who goes fishing will know that some of the greatest pressure when the fish is on is at that bend, sort of that curve in the J of the hook. Now, if you carve a hook, it might snap. But if you can grow a hook into that shape, you will retain much of the strength of that natural material. And speaking of the strength of natural materials, the materials that we use to make this koi, which is in a very particular style, are also very strong. The native hardwoods that we use could be turned into very strong tool handles. And if you look very closely at this koi, it's not lashed like most koi, most adzes that we think of. The blade, the stone blade, is hafted to a very special kind of wedge. And if you look carefully, the wedge is slotted into a groove on the handle. What this allows us to do is to turn the blade in any direction we'd like, because it is lashed into that groove and held tight. Now, this special kind of koi, called the koi kupai ke'e, is used for different purposes, but is especially useful for the building of canoes. Because when you begin to gouge out the inside of your wa'a, whether it be a small canoe or a large canoe, if you use this tool, you can also begin to carve the edges. As the blade is put into that socket, you can use it in this manner, but you can also turn it. You could put it into an orientation just like an axe if you wanted to, and finish the inside and the inner walls of that wa'a. And that makes for a really useful tool because you don't have to switch it out. You can undo the lashing and change the alignment of that particular blade edge, which makes this the kind of tool that is very useful for people who would be carving canoes or carving in very tight spaces. Much like we have nowadays, the tool sets of our ancestors were varied, and multifunction tools were incredibly valuable. But the way this relates to ku is the idea of ku ba'ike'e, which is to say ku who sort of takes up the imperfections or the leftovers of the wood. So ku ba'ike'e is associated with the carving of humula'au, of trees, of wood. And it seems like we might have another question.
Would they carve the way the tree grows?
That is a great question. Depending on the purpose of the carving, you might go with a particular grain. However, many of our hardwood trees in Hawaii can be carved in different ways that perhaps are not necessarily going exactly with the grain, but because of the dense nature of the wood, can be carved to different shapes. However, that takes the expertise of a wood carver. And certainly I am not an expert in the wood carving traditions of my ancestors in the way that they did them, but we can see from some of the objects that they have left behind for us in safekeeping at the museum that they certainly did know what they were doing, no matter what wood they were using. But particularly see fish hooks like this used in other parts of the Pacific. Here in Hawaii, we had special adaptations to the growing of those things, and we find it more commonly than in other parts of the Pacific. But particularly when we talk about the Pacific, here in Hawaii, the idea of ku as an akua is very significant. Ku not only associated with the practices of fishing, which are the season that we are coming out of now. We'll be arriving in the period of Lono in a few months, and if you come to the museum, you might see some changes to the area of Hawaiian Hall, particularly on the first floor, what we call Kaiakea. But for now, Ku is supreme, Ku Nui Akea, that same akua. But as he rules supreme, he also allows us to be in this warm summer month of, well, the end of September, and we can enjoy fishing, carving, and many of the other aspects that are associated with ku. But for now, we'll be signing off. And we invite you folks to tune in next week for another edition of WāKahikoWednesday. So we'll be taking another look at objects in our collections and how they relate to Hawaiian culture as a whole. But like we say at the museum, it's never goodbye, it's ahui ho. So, ahui ho kako, we'll see you again. Mahalo.